In the spring of 1988, a woman in a couture suit walked the marble lobby of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan at 7 in the morning, running one gloved fingertip along the top of a gilded picture frame, checking for dust. She knew the names of the doormen. She knew which chandeliers had been cleaned that week and which had not. She was the president of the hotel, one of the most famous buildings in America, and her salary, announced by her husband to a room full of reporters with evident delight, was $1 a year. $1, he said, and all the dresses she could buy. The reporters laughed. It was a good line, and it was designed to be a good line, and it worked exactly as intended, because for more than 30 years, almost nobody stopped laughing long enough to ask the obvious question. If Ivana Trump was capable of running the Plaza Hotel, and before that, a casino in Atlantic City with thousands of employees, and before that, the interiors of the tower that carried the family name, then who, exactly, built the empire that history filed under her husband's name alone? The 1980s made Donald Trump a legend of American business. The same decade made Ivana Trump a punchline, a hairstyle, an accent to be imitated at dinner parties. One of those two people held the title of chief executive at a major casino. It was not the one you were told about. Stay with me. The truth is stranger. Because the story of this marriage is not the fairy tale the wedding photographs sold, and it is not the tabloid war the divorce became. It is the story of a woman who did the work, watched another name go on the building, and then, when it all burned down, built a second empire out of the ashes of the first, this time with her own name on the label. And there is one detail from the very end of her life, a grave beside a golf course fairway in New Jersey, that I will come back to before we finish, because it says more about this marriage than any settlement ever did. Here is what I am going to show you. First, how a girl born in communist Czechoslovakia in 1949 used a pair of skis and a marriage of paperwork to get out from behind the Iron Curtain, a beginning harder and stranger than anything her husband ever survived. Second, the two properties the record says she actually ran: Trump's castle in Atlantic City, where she held the titles of chief executive and president, and the Plaza Hotel, and what she did with them. Third, why that $1 salary was not a joke but a mechanism, and what a 2011 study of $1 chief executives reveals about arrangements like it. Fourth, the divorce war of 1990, including the 4 separate prenuptial agreements this marriage generated, and why the fourth and final one ended up contested in the press. And fifth, the second act almost nobody takes seriously: the clothing, the jewelry, the fragrance empire she sold through television under her own first name, after the famous surname had been fought over and priced. A word on where this comes from. This channel does not deal in rumor. We read the biographies, the reference records, the court coverage, and the scholarship on family businesses, and we tell you what holds up. When a claim is contested, when something is her version, I will say so. She was born Ivana Zelničková on February 20th, 1949, in the industrial town of Gottwaldov, in what was then communist Czechoslovakia. The town's very name tells you what kind of world she entered. For centuries it had been called Zlín, and it had been the home of the Batashu Empire, one of the great capitalist success stories of Central Europe. Until the communists took power in 1948, nationalized the factories, and renamed the entire town after Klement Gottwald, the country's first communist president. So Ivana grew up, quite literally, in a place where a family's name had been stripped off the buildings that family built and replaced with the name of the man in power. Keep that in mind. It will not be the last time she watches it happen. Her father, Milos Zelnicek, was an engineer, and he put her on skis when she was a toddler. By some accounts, before she was old enough to read, by her own account at around age 4. And skiing became the whole architecture of her young life. Because in a closed country, athletics was one of the only doors that opened outward. A skier could cross borders with a team, while her neighbors could not cross them at all. She trained seriously through the 1960s, competing at a high level in a national system that treated athletes as state assets. And she went on to study physical education at Charles University in Prague. She was 19 years old in August of 1968 when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, and whatever ambiguity had existed about her country's future ended under those treads. She understood very early a lesson that would organize everything that came afterward. Performance was currency, and currency was freedom. In 1971, she married an Austrian ski instructor named Alfred Winkelmeyer, a marriage she later described in essentially administrative terms, a marriage of paperwork. And the marriage did what it was designed to do. It gave her an Austrian passport, and an Austrian passport meant the border was no longer a wall. She did not stay in that marriage. It was dissolved within 2 years, and she did not stay in Austria. She made her way to Canada, to Montreal, following a longtime boyfriend, a fellow skier named George Siravatka, and there she worked as a model through the early 1970s, doing showroom work and fur campaigns, learning English on top of her Czech and German, supporting herself entirely, answerable to no one. By 1976, she was doing promotional work connected to the Montreal Summer Olympics, and it was that work that brought her to New York. Hold that image for a moment, because the myth requires you to forget it. The myth says a beautiful young woman met a rich young developer and was lifted into a golden life. The record says that by the time Ivana Zelnichkova walked into a Manhattan restaurant called Maxwell's Plum in 1976 and met Donald Trump, who, by the account both of them told, talked his way into paying for her table's dinner, she had already engineered her own escape from a police state, restarted her life on a second continent, and built a working career with no family money and no famous name behind her. He was a 30-year-old developer from Queens with his father's outer borough apartment business behind him and large Manhattan ambitions in front of him. She was a woman who had outplanned a government. They were married in April of 1977 at Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan with the celebrity pastor Norman Vincent Peale, the author of The Power of Positive Thinking, the family's house theologian of self-promotion, presiding. Their first child, Donald Jr., arrived on the very last day of that year, December 31st, and 2 more followed, Ivanka in 1981, Eric in 1984. The wedding photographs are luminous. Every fairy tale needs a luminous beginning. And we, the audience, the magazine buyers, the wedding page readers, we took the photographs at face value because that is what we do with photographs. What happened over the next 12 years happened largely out of frame, and it is the reason this episode exists. She spent them working, and the record of that work was quietly folded into someone else's legend. To understand how that folding happens, you need to understand the machine that does it, because it is not unique to this marriage. Scholars who study family enterprises have a name for the people it erases, the invisible contributors. A 2012 study of family and family business systems describes how, in a family firm, the roles of spouse and executive collapse into one another, which means a spouse's work can be classified as help rather than employment, generating no salary history, no contract, no pension, no claim. A 2005 study in the International Handbook of Women and Small Business Entrepreneurship found the same pattern from the other side. Wives in family firms routinely perform work that would carry executive titles in any public company, while the credit flows to the name on the letterhead, because the firm's brand and the husband's name are the same asset. In the Trump Organization, there was only ever one name on the letterhead and the entire business model. Before the casinos, before the airline, before everything, was the promotion of that name. Now watch the mechanism operate in three moves. Move 1, in the early 1980s. As Trump Tower rose on Fifth Avenue, Ivana was given responsibility for interiors and finishes, with the title of Vice President of Interior Design. This was not picking curtains. She traveled to Italian quarries to select the breccia pernis, the rose-pink marble that lines the tower's five-story atrium. She oversaw the brass, the mirrors, the 80-foot waterfall that made the lobby a tourist attraction in its own right. When the building opened in 1983, that lobby became the single most photographed piece of evidence for Donald Trump's golden touch. The look that became the brand was, to a very large degree, her look. The building opened, and the building was his. Move 2, in 1985, she was sent to Atlantic City, and here the record becomes unusually explicit. Because the standard reference accounts of the Trump family state it plainly, Ivana was appointed Chief Executive Officer and President of the Trump Castle Hotel and Casino, not hostess, not decorator, not advisor, and President of a boardwalk casino, a property acquired from Hilton for a price in the region of $320 million, an operation with roughly 4,000 employees, state regulators, cash rooms counted under camera, unions and margins measured nightly. She commuted between Manhattan and Atlantic City, often by helicopter, often several days a week, and ran it. Move 3, in 1988, when her husband bought the Plaza Hotel for a price reported at just over $400 million, she was moved again, installed at the top of the most storied hotel in New York, tasked with restoring a faded landmark to what it had been. Which brings us back to that press conference and the dollar. Because the dollar did not only appear at a podium, Donald Trump took out a full-page open letter in New York Magazine to celebrate the Plaza purchase, in which he wrote that he had not purchased a building, he had purchased a masterpiece, the Mona Lisa, and that for the first time in his life he had knowingly made a deal that was not economic. And in that same letter he installed his wife as president and priced her $1 a year and all the dresses she can buy. That 2011 study I promised you at the top, published in the CNN electronic journal, examined the strange economics of chief executives who work for a $1 salary, and what that literature makes clear is that a $1 salary is never really about the dollar. It is a signal, an arrangement whose real meaning lies in what surrounds it. Think of the famous cases. Lee Iacocca took $1 a year at Chrysler in 1978. But he took it alongside stock options that made him rich when the company recovered. Steve Jobs took $1 a year at Apple, while holding equity and grants ultimately worth billions. The researchers found that $1 CAOs are, almost without exception, large shareholders. The dollar signals sacrifice while equity does the paying. And the gesture is often better understood as theater aimed at boards, unions, and the press than as compensation at all. Now ask what Ivana's dollar signaled and what surrounded it. She held no equity in the Plaza. She held no equity in the Trump Organization. There were no options vesting behind the gesture. The dollar, delivered inside a joke about dresses, signaled to the world that her presidency was an ornament, a rich man's indulgence of a wife's hobby. The work was real. The compensation was a punchline, and the punchline was the point, because a punchline cannot later stand in a courtroom or a history book and claim to have built anything. Look closely at three scenes from those years, because each one shows a different face of the same arrangement. The first scene is Atlantic City, the second half of the 1980s. A casino is one of the least forgiving businesses in America. It is a bank, a hotel, a theater, and a security operation running simultaneously, 24 hours a day, under the eye of the New Jersey Casino Control Commission, which licenses individual executives and audits the movement of cash down to the drop box. Into this, the organization sent a woman whose formal business education had come from modeling contracts and her own watchfulness, and the record states she held the top titles there. She learned the count rooms and the comp policies, the brutal arithmetic by which a casino decides which high roller gets the free suite and which gets a polite goodbye. She renovated the property upward, adding crystal, marble, and suites aimed at exactly the premium players the castle had been losing. And under her tenure, the castle's revenues climbed into the hundreds of millions of dollars a year. She became famous internally for a managerial style you could call Habsburg. White glove inspections, an obsession with detail, a memory for the names of housekeepers, and a memory just as long for their mistakes. And here is a detail that tells you the work was real. Her fiercest competition was not Caesars or Bally's down the boardwalk. It was Trump Plaza, her husband's other Atlantic City casino, run by his executive Stephen Hyde, and Donald openly pitted the two properties against each other, comparing their monthly numbers, so that his wife and his hired professionals fought over the same pool of gamblers wearing the same name on their buildings. Employees found her demanding. Employees found her decorative. The second scene is the Plaza, 1988 to 1990. The hotel she inherited was a legend running on the fumes of its own reputation, an 80-year-old French Renaissance landmark at the corner of Central Park, with more than 800 rooms, tarnished gilt, tired service, and a staff accustomed to coasting on the address. She went through it floor by floor, regilding, restoring, resetting standards, retraining staff, overhauling the restaurants, with the stated ambition of making it the finest hotel in the world, and by her own account she was walking the property at dawn, precisely because a hotel's failures happen at dawn, the unpolished brass, the late room service, the frame nobody dusted. Ghosts. And the New York press of the period could see the change. The woman with the accent and the chignon was in the building before the breakfast shift. The $1 joke had been told at the beginning of this era, and it hung over all of it, doing its quiet work. Every profile of the hotel's revival somehow became a profile of her husband's brilliance in buying it. He had, by his own written admission, overpaid for a trophy. She was the one tasked with making the trophy earn, and the credit ran, as the family business scholars would predict, straight to the letterhead. The third scene is smaller. December 1989, a ski slope in Aspen, Colorado. The Trumps were on a family holiday, and outside a mountain restaurant called Bonnie's. Ivana, the former competitive skier, the woman whose whole life had begun on skis, encountered a young actress and model from Georgia named Marla Maples, and, by Ivana's own later account, that young woman introduced herself with words to the effect of, "I love your husband, do you?" No wife hears that twice. The confrontation happened in public, on snow, in front of her husband, and, eventually, her children, on the one surface on Earth where Ivana Trump had never once been out. Skied, and by some accounts she made the point literally, chasing her husband down the run and skiing backwards in front of him to shout at his face. Within weeks the marriage was in the newspapers, and then it was the newspapers. On February 11, 1990, the gossip columnist Liz Smith broke the separation on the front page of the New York Daily News, and what followed was unlike anything the tabloids had done before. Roughly a dozen consecutive days of front pages. A circulation war fought through the marriage itself, with Liz Smith at the Daily News carrying Ivana's side and Cindy Adams at the New York Post carrying Donald's, each spouse effectively leaking through a designated columnist. The Post produced what its own editors later called one of the most famous front pages in tabloid history. A Marla Maples quote about Donald, best sex I've ever had. And the story ran for month after month in 1990, like a serialized novel, elbowing actual news off the front of New York's papers. And here is the thing to notice about that coverage, the thing we did not notice at the time because we were too busy buying it. The story was always framed as a woman losing a husband. It was never framed as a company losing an executive. The CIO of the castle, the president of the plaza, walked out of the organization she had helped operate for over a decade, and the business press barely registered a departure because the dollar had done its job. Officially, nothing had ever been there. So let us do what the coverage never did and read the ending like a ledger. Item 1, the prenuptial agreements, all 4 of them, because I promised you 4, and the count matters. The first was drawn up before the 1977 wedding, under the guidance of Donald's mentor and fixer, the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn, reportedly astonishingly small, a token settlement for a marriage nobody expected to sit atop casinos. The second and third were renegotiations as the fortune grew through the 80s, each one repricing the marriage upward as the empire expanded. And the fourth, the final agreement, signed at Christmas of 1987, is the one that went to war. And here is why it ended up contested. When the end came, Ivana's lawyer, Michael Kennedy, argued that the fourth agreement should not stand as written, that she had signed without full knowledge of the fortune's true scale, and that her decade of executive work had earned her a share of the enterprise itself. Her side floated claims reaching toward half the empire's supposed value. The Cultural Sociology of Divorce Encyclopedia, in a 2013 entry on prenuptial agreements, describes what these documents really are: an attempt to price a partnership before anyone knows what the partnership will build. And that is precisely the problem all 4 Trump prenups could not solve. The early agreements had priced a model marrying a developer. Nobody, not even the fourth agreement, signed at the empire's height, had priced the CIO of a casino, because on paper, for $1 a year, no such person existed. The dollar had not just hidden her work from the newspapers, it had hidden it from the settlement table. Item 2, the settlement, and its timing, which is the cruelest irony in this whole story. The divorce concluded in the early 1990s with Ivana receiving, as widely reported at the time, a lump sum in the region of $14 million, along with the family's 45-room mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, an apartment, support payments, and even a stipulated month each year at Mar-a-Lago. But consider what was happening to the empire at that exact moment. By 1990, Donald Trump was drowning, carrying debts in the billions, with roughly $900 million of it personally guaranteed, kept afloat only by a banker's bailout that famously put him on an allowance, with the Taj Mahal casino heading into bankruptcy. Ivana was arguing for half of an empire that was, on paper, collapsing into a negative number. So she took the guaranteed $14 million rather than half of a possible nothing. A defensible decision, even a shrewd one, but set the number against the decade of titles, and it reads less like a share of an empire than a severance package with better real estate. Item 3, the second act. And this is where the story turns, because most first wives in her position took the settlement and disappeared into charity lunches. Ivana went back to work. She built a fashion and jewelry business, the House of Ivana, and sold it through the Home Shopping Network. Hour after hour of live, unscripted television, no second takes, moving dresses and earrings directly to the American women who had followed her divorce like a war, at price points those women could actually afford. The reported numbers were startling. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of merchandise moving in a single hour of airtime. Tens of millions in annual sales at the venture's height. Understand what a feat that is. Live retail television is one of the most nakedly meritocratic formats in commerce. Either the phones ring or they do not, and no famous surname can dial them for you. Hers rang. The fashion establishment condescended to it. The customers did not. Item 4, the fragrance line. A 2019 case study in Bloomsbury Fashion Business Cases lays out the marketing model of the fragrance industry, an industry that does not really sell scent. It sells identity in a bottle, a story a customer can wear. The proof of the model was already on the shelves. Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds, launched in 1991, went on to gross more than $1 billion over its lifetime, not because of what it smelled like, but because of what Elizabeth Taylor's survival story meant to the women buying it. Read Ivana's venture through that model, and you see how shrewd it was. By the mid-1990s, Ivana was one of the most recognizable single names in America. She no longer needed the surname on the bottle. And that first name came attached to a ready-made story, survival, betrayal, self-reinvention. She bottled it and sold it to women who wanted some of it for themselves. She had spent the 80s building someone else's brand for $1. She spent the 90s proving she had understood branding better than almost anyone in the building. Item 5, The Voice. She wrote books, a 1992 novel, For Love Alone, whose heroine, a beautiful Eastern European athlete who marries an American tycoon and is betrayed, hewed so conspicuously close to her own story that the Roman Acleef reading was the marketing. It became a bestseller and a television movie, and a second novel and an advice book on surviving divorce followed. She wrote an advice column, Ask Ivana, dispensing counsel to heartbroken readers of a supermarket tabloid, a format the sophisticated mocked and millions read. And in 1996 she appeared, playing herself in The First Wives Club, a film about discarded first wives that grossed over $100 million in American theaters, and delivered a single line that became her epitaph in her own lifetime, "Don't get mad, get everything." America laughed and applauded. Very few people noticed the line was not a joke. It was a summary of the previous 20 years, delivered by the only person with standing to make it. And now the part almost every obituary missed, the detail that reframes everything you have just heard. After the divorce, after the front pages, after the fight over the prenup, after all of it, Ivana kept the name. She had a maiden name older than the marriage, and a public grievance large enough to justify shedding Trump forever, and she never did. Through 3 subsequent decades, not through 2 more marriages of her own, both of which she exited while remaining, on every book cover and every product label, a Trump, because she understood, with the same cold clarity she had once applied to a border crossing, that the name was the most valuable asset the settlement left her, an asset she had personally helped build at the castle and the plaza for $1 a year, and she was not going to walk away and leave her own equity on the table a second time. The girl from Gottwaldov had watched a family's name get stripped from the buildings that family built. She was not going to let it happen to her share of this one. That is the harder truth under this story, and it implicates the fairy tale from both directions. She was not only the empire's uncredited operator. She was also, willingly, one of the authors of its myth. She posed for the luminous photographs. She performed the golden marriage for the cameras through the whole of the 80s, and later she sold the wronged wife saga with the same discipline, right down to a 2017 memoir about raising the children whose title put the surname on the jacket one more time. And we bought every chapter from every vendor. The love story, the war, the revenge, the perfume. We built a fairy tale around this couple, and when it collapsed, we simply bought the ruins, ticket by ticket. She died on July 14, 2022, at the age of 73, after a fall down the stairs in her townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The medical examiner ruled it an accident, blunt impact injuries, alone in the house that the empire's unraveling had bought her. And then came the detail I promised you at the beginning. Ivana Trump was buried at the Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, laid to rest on the grounds of a property bearing the name she had helped build and never relinquished, near the start of the course, not far from the first tee, under a modest granite stone carrying little more than her name and her dates. Reporters noted, in the weeks that followed, that New Jersey law grants tax advantages to land used for cemetery purposes, and that the family business had explored designating ground at Bedminster for exactly that use years before. Nobody outside the family can say what the family's intent was, and no reporting has established one. But whatever the intentions, her grave sits inside a structure where sentiment and balance sheet cannot be cleanly told apart, which is as concise a description of this marriage as anyone will ever write. Even in death, the property is not in her name. If you want a single image for what this marriage was, that is the one, the woman who ran the empire, resting inside it, while the sign out front still says, "Only him." History is unsentimental about this. It keeps the name on the building and loses the names of the people who kept the building running, and it does this most reliably to wives, whose work is filed under love and therefore under nothing. The record of Ivana Trump says chief executive. The legend says first wife. This channel exists for the space between those two sentences. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Behind the Portrait and press the like button, because it genuinely helps these longer histories find the people who want them. And there are more marriages in the archive whose photographs have been lying to you for decades. I will see you at the next portrait.